There is a little girl standing in a doorway. She is 6 years old, wearing a yellow sundress with white daisies along the hem. Her hair is pulled back in 2 pigtails, the kind that a mother ties carefully in the morning, with the sort of attention that says, "You are everything." She has her mother's eyes. She has her mother's laugh. And on the morning of June 14th, 2001, she walks through a door and disappears from her mother's life for the next 10 years. Her name is Sophie Grace Taylor, and this is the story of how a mother refused to stop looking. Most missing child cases follow a terrible, predictable rhythm. The first 48 hours carry the most hope. Then the leads dry up, the posters fade, the phone calls slow. The world, brutal and indifferent, moves on, and the parent is left standing in a silent house, holding a photograph, wondering how something so alive and so loved can simply be gone. Rebecca Taylor did not move on. She could not. She would not. For 10 years she held on to a thread, and in the summer of 2011, at a birthday party in a public park, that thread led her all the way back to her daughter. In this video, we're going to walk through what we know, from the morning Sophie disappeared to the moment Rebecca saw a 16-year-old girl across a crowded park and felt something in her chest crack wide open. We are going to look at the planning, the deception, and the decade of searching. We are going to sit with the questions that still don't have clean answers. And we are going to try to understand how a man that a family trusted with their child became the reason that family was destroyed. This is a story about love and patience and the kind of grief that has no name. It is also a story about a plate on a car, a photograph from a decade ago, and the moment when 2 pieces of a puzzle finally, impossibly, locked together. Let's begin. If you are finding this story for the first time and you want to follow along as we go deeper, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Channels like this exist because communities of people who care about cases like Sophie's keep showing up. Your support means we keep telling these stories. Leave a comment below if you knew about this case already or if this is your first time hearing it. Cedar Park, Texas sits just north of Austin, in a part of the state that has that particular quality of American suburban life. Wide streets, good schools, neighbors who wave at each other in the driveway. A community that feels safe in the way that communities are supposed to feel safe. In 2001, it was the kind of place where a mother felt comfortable for a few hours, leaving her 6-year-old daughter with a trusted adult. Rebecca Taylor was 32 years old that summer. She was raising Sophie largely on her own, working at a law firm in Austin. The job was demanding in the way that jobs at law firms are always demanding. Long hours, sudden deadlines, the kind of pressure that does not pause for personal schedules. She was good at managing. She was used to problem solving. She had built a life that worked. Sophie Grace Taylor was 6 years old, and by all accounts, a child who lit up a room. People who knew the family from that period describe her as bright, talkative, the kind of kid who asked questions about everything and remembered your answers the next time she saw you. She was finishing her first year of elementary school. She loved drawing. She loved her mother. She was, by every measure, a child deeply embedded in a life, in a community, in a family. David Mitchell was Sophie's former teacher. He had worked at the elementary school where Sophie attended kindergarten. He was considered by teachers and parents alike to be one of those educators who genuinely cared. He remembered students' names. He was patient. He knew how to talk to children in a way that made them feel seen. Parents liked him. The school liked him. Rebecca Taylor liked him well enough that on June 14, 2001, when something urgent came up at work and she needed coverage for a few hours, she called him. It was not the first time. He had watched Sophie before. Small favors, brief windows, the kind of informal childcare arrangement that parents occasionally build with people they trust from their child's school lives. David Mitchell had always been reliable. He had always been appropriate. There had never been a reason for concern. Rebecca dropped Sophie off at David Mitchell's home at approximately 10 in the morning. She told Sophie she would be back by lunch, maybe a little after. She kissed her daughter's head. She left. She would not see Sophie Grace Taylor again for 10 years. The situation at the law firm took longer than expected. That is the way these things go. A deposition ran long. A client call ate up time. By the time Rebecca was pulling back onto the street where David Mitchell lived, it was early afternoon, closer to 1 o'clock than she had planned. She was not panicked. She was a little apologetic. She knocked on the door of his house. There was no answer. She knocked again. She tried calling his phone. No answer there either. She walked around to the side of the house and looked through the window into the kitchen. The house looked empty. It looked still. It had the quality of a place where no one was home, and not in the casual sense, not in the sense of he stepped out to run an errand. Empty in a deeper, more unsettling way. Rebecca Taylor stood in David Mitchell's driveway and called her daughter's name. Silence. She called the police at 1:23 p.m. What followed in the next several hours was a controlled escalation of something that began as a possible miscommunication and became, with terrifying speed, a confirmed disappearance. Officers arrived at Mitchell's home and found that the house was not just empty of people, it had been partially cleared. Personal items were gone, clothing was missing. There was nothing that looked like a struggle. There was no sign of distress. What there was instead was the unmistakable feeling of someone who had left deliberately. By that evening, law enforcement had begun pulling on threads. What they found unraveled fast. David Mitchell had submitted his resignation from the elementary school 2 weeks earlier. He had given no explanation to administrators beyond a vague claim about personal reasons, a family matter he needed to attend to. His colleagues had been surprised. His departure had been quiet, and because the school year was nearly over, no one had pressed hard for details. He was liked. He was trusted. No one had thought to ask the harder questions. 3 days before Sophie disappeared, June 11, 2001, David Mitchell had walked into his bank and made a cash withdrawal of $15,000. This was not a man in the habit of carrying cash. His account history showed no prior withdrawals of that scale. $15,000 in cash, taken 3 days before a 6-year-old girl vanished from his care. He had planned this. That is the detail that investigators kept returning to in the early days of the case. This was not an impulsive act. This was not a moment of opportunity that a troubled man stumbled into. David Mitchell had resigned his job. He had withdrawn cash to avoid a traceable paper trail. He had created the conditions for a disappearance that looked from the outside clean. No ransom note, no crime scene, no body. Just a man and a little girl who were suddenly completely gone. An Amber Alert was issued for Sophie Grace Taylor. Her photograph went out across Texas and then across the country. Dark hair, pigtails, yellow sundress with white daisies, eyes that looked directly at the camera with the unguarded confidence of a child who had never been given a reason not to trust the world. For days, nothing came back. The early search was the kind that consumes everything around it. Rebecca Taylor became overnight the face of a missing child's mother in the way that the media sometimes fixates on: interviews, photographs, the kind of public grief that is also a plea. She answered every question. She held up Sophie's picture at every press conference. She said the things that every parent in that situation says, the things that are true and desperate and not enough. I love her. I miss her. If anyone knows anything, please call. The tip lines filled with calls. Volunteers organized searches. Local law enforcement worked in coordination with state and federal agencies because this case had the hallmarks of a deliberate abduction: planning, cash, and an adult with legitimate access who had turned that access into an escape route. Leads came in, leads were pursued, and leads ran cold. There were sightings, the way there always are in high-profile missing children cases. A man matching Mitchell's description seen at a gas station in San Antonio. A child who looked like Sophie spotted at a rest stop near El Paso. A tip about a rental property in Louisiana. Each one was investigated. None of them held up. David Mitchell had covered his tracks well. He had purchased the car he was driving months before the disappearance, using a transaction that was difficult to trace in the document infrastructure of 2001. He had no prior criminal record, which meant that law enforcement had no existing fingerprints on file beyond what could be collected from his former home. He had, as far as investigators could determine, no close family in a position to shelter him. He appeared to have no known associates outside the state. He had thought about this. He had thought about what it would take to disappear with a child and not be found. And in the summer and fall of 2001, with the entire country's attention suddenly pivoting to events in September that consumed every available resource and cultural bandwidth, David Mitchell and Sophie Grace Taylor slipped through the cracks. It is one of the harder truths of this case. The fall of 2001 was not a period when the country had unlimited capacity to focus on every ongoing investigation. Law enforcement agencies stretched thin. Media cycles, which had been heavily focused on Sophie's disappearance through the summer, turned to other things. Rebecca Taylor kept calling, kept pushing, kept showing up at the FBI field office in Austin with new ideas, new angles, new requests. She was not going to let them forget. By the end of 2001, the investigation was ongoing, but cold in the way that cases go cold, officially open, actively understaffed, regularly reviewed, but no longer driven by the hot urgency of the first weeks. Rebecca Taylor marked Sophie's 7th birthday in December with a candle and a photograph, and the particular kind of grief that is not clean because there is no ending, just an open wound that does not heal. The years that followed were, for Rebecca, a kind of double life. She continued working. She had to. She had bills, a mortgage, a life that required maintaining. She went to work at the law firm. She came home. She kept the tip line number in her phone. She maintained a website that had gone up in the early days of Sophie's disappearance, a simple page with Sophie's photograph and contact information for anyone with information. She updated it periodically with new age progression images, photographs created by forensic specialists showing what Sophie might look like as she grew, at age 7, at age 8, at age 10. She kept every piece of paper the police had ever given her in a binder in her home office. She did not redecorate Sophie's room. There is a particular kind of love that operates in the absence of resolution. It is not hope exactly, though it contains hope. It is not despair, though despair lives in it too. It is something more stubborn than either, a refusal to assign an ending to a story that has not ended. Rebecca Taylor spent 10 years living in that refusal. She did not go to grief counselors who encouraged her to accept what might have happened. She did not let friends gently suggest that moving on was not the same as giving up. She held her position. She was right to hold it. In the spring of 2003, nearly 2 years after Sophie's disappearance, investigators received what appeared to be a promising lead. A woman in New Mexico contacted the tip line to say that she had seen a man and a young girl at a county fair who had made her uneasy. The girl was quiet in a way that seemed off. The man was attentive in a way the woman described as watchful. She had taken a photograph on a disposable camera, and she had been carrying it around undeveloped for weeks because something kept nagging at her. She developed the photograph and mailed it in. The image was grainy, shot from a distance at a county fair, the kind of photograph that is more wishful than useful. The girl in the image was roughly the right age. The hair color was close. The man beside her was turned partly away from the camera, his face obscured by a hat. Investigators compared the image against what they had for David Mitchell. They could not confirm, they could not rule it out. Rebecca Taylor, when she was shown the photograph, said she thought the girl could be Sophie. She sat with it for a long time. She said she could not be certain. The New Mexico lead did not develop into anything actionable. The woman who had taken the photograph could not recall exactly where at the fair she had been standing, or which direction the man and girl had been walking. Law enforcement in New Mexico conducted canvasses in the relevant areas. Nothing came back. Another door closed. By 2005, Sophie would have been 10 years old. Rebecca had a new age progression image made. It showed a girl with her mother's bone structure, darker hair, that same directness in the eyes that the original school photograph had caught. Rebecca posted it on the website. She sent it to every law enforcement contact she still had. She wrote letters. She kept writing letters. In 2007, a shift in the case came not from any new lead, but from a structural change in how missing children's information was shared and maintained. A federal database update allowed for better cross-referencing of certain older cases with newer records. Sophie's file was flagged and reviewed. A detective in the Austin field office, a woman who had not been part of the original investigation but had been assigned to review cold cases in her department, came across the Taylor file and spent several days going through it. She called Rebecca Taylor. What followed was not a breakthrough, not in the explosive sense, but it was something, a renewed engagement with the case, a fresh set of eyes on paperwork that had been sitting in a drawer for 6 years. The detective's name was Karen Alcott. She went back through every documented lead, every tip line record, every piece of paper. She cross-referenced Mitchell's known background information against records she had access to. She found some things that had been noted and then somewhere in the churn of the investigation not fully followed up on. Mitchell had, in the years before Sophie's disappearance, made several trips to rural areas of central Texas. The records were thin, but they existed: a rental receipt, a record of having passed through a particular county. It was the kind of information that, in the urgency of the first days of the investigation, had been noted and then left while more immediate leads were pursued. Detective Alcott circled it. She filed a request for additional records from those counties. She did not find Mitchell, but she narrowed the geography of where he might be. It was not enough, not yet, but it was a line being drawn on a map, a shape beginning to form in the dark. Rebecca Taylor, when she met with Detective Alcott in late 2007, came away with something she had not felt in a long time: the sense that someone who had institutional access and institutional tools was genuinely engaged with finding her daughter. She thanked the detective. She drove home. She sat in Sophie's room for a long time that night. The room still had Sophie's drawings on the wall, crayon animals, purple horses, a house with a yellow sun above it, a shelf of picture books with cracked spines from years of being read and reread, a small white dresser with stickers on the drawer pulls. The kind of room that becomes, in the absence of a child, a kind of shrine that also a wound. Rebecca Taylor looked at her daughter's drawings and thought about what it would mean to find her. Sophie would be 12 by then. Whatever had happened in those 6 years, whatever Mitchell had told her, whatever version of the world he had constructed around her, she would be a different child than the one who had walked out the door in a yellow sundress in June of 2001. Rebecca understood that. She had thought about it many times. She had read everything she could find about children who had been taken young and recovered later, about the psychological complexity of those reunions, about the work of rebuilding after a loss that long and that deep. She knew it would not be a simple reunion. She wanted it anyway. She wanted Sophie back in any form Sophie existed in. That thought stayed with her through 2008, through 2009, through 2010. Detective Alcott remained in contact, updating Rebecca when there was something to report and being honest when there was not. The records from the central Texas counties had yielded some material, but nothing actionable. Mitchell had not used his real name in any transaction that could be clearly identified. He was operating under something else, a name they had not yet found, in a way that had been careful enough to stay ahead of what the investigation could reach. 10 years. By the spring of 2011, Sophie Grace Taylor would have been 16 years old. Rebecca had an age progression image made that reflected this, the most recent one, a photograph of a young woman who existed only in the imagination of forensic technology and a mother's fierce refusal to stop imagining. The image went back up on the website. It went back out to law enforcement contacts. Rebecca wrote another round of letters. She attended a missing children's awareness event in Austin in April of 2011. She had attended many of these over the years. She spoke when asked. She carried Sophie's photograph. She stood in rooms full of other parents who understood, in the deep, wordless way that only that particular grief allows, exactly what she carried. She drove home. She marked the 10-year anniversary of Sophie's disappearance in June of 2011 with a vigil outside the Cedar Park Community Center. Candles, photographs, the quiet ceremony of a community that had never entirely let go of the case. Local news covered it. An anchor said that Sophie Grace Taylor had been missing for exactly 10 years, that her case remained open, and that anyone with information was encouraged to contact the relevant tip lines. Rebecca stood in the candlelight and looked at the age progression image of her daughter on the board behind her. She did not know, standing there, that she was 5 weeks away from finding her. It was a Saturday in July of 2011, a birthday party, a public park in a suburb south of Austin, the kind of sprawling green space that fills up on weekends with families, folding tables, balloons tied to fence posts, children running between adults. Rebecca was there because a colleague's daughter was turning 8, a child Sophie's age would have been in a different world. She had come because saying no to all of life's ordinary moments had become its own kind of loss, and she was trying that year to show up more. She was standing near the food table with a paper plate when she saw the girl. 16, maybe. Dark hair. The way she held herself. A quality in the way she turned her head and looked out across the park at something in the middle distance. Rebecca put down her plate. She had looked at Sophie's face, the real face and the projected faces, every day for 10 years. She had looked at that age progression image so many times that she could have drawn it from memory. And standing in a public park on an ordinary Saturday in July, something in her body registered what her mind was only starting to catch up to. The girl was standing with a man. Mid-50s maybe, heavyset now in a way that a photograph from 2001 would not have predicted, but people change over 10 years, bodies change, and faces change in ways that age progression images don't fully capture. He was watching the girl with the particular watchfulness that Rebecca had been described in that note from New Mexico years ago. Attentive in a way that wanted to look casual and did not quite manage it. Rebecca did not approach them. She did what she had been told years earlier by law enforcement to do if she ever thought she saw Sophie in public. She stayed calm. She watched. She took out her phone. The man had a car parked at the edge of the lot near the park entrance. She could see it from where she was standing. She watched until she had a clear view of the license plate. She typed the number into her phone. Then she kept watching, kept her distance, kept her hand steady, and waited until the man and the girl got in the car and left the parking lot. She called Detective Alcott. She was shaking when she dialed. She had been not shaking for 10 years out of sheer discipline and the necessity of functioning, and now, standing next to a table covered with birthday cake and paper napkins, she was shaking. She said, "Karen, I think I just saw my daughter." Detective Alcott picked up on the second ring. Later, Rebecca would not be able to remember exactly what she said in those first seconds. The words came out in pieces, the way words do when the body is running faster than the mind, when 10 years of disciplined waiting suddenly breaks open all at once. But she had the license plate. She had typed it carefully before she called. She read it out loud twice, slowly, making sure Alcott had every digit. Alcott told her to go home. She told her to stay calm. She told her not to go back to that parking lot, not to try to follow the car, not to do anything that might alert anyone that the plate had been noted. She told Rebecca she would call her back. Rebecca drove home. She sat at her kitchen table and did not move for 45 minutes. She looked at the age progression image she kept pinned above her desk, the one she had commissioned in the spring of 2011, the 16-year-old version of Sophie Grace Taylor that existed only as a forensic projection. She looked at it the way she had looked at it 1,000 times. And she thought about the girl in the park, the way she had stood, the particular angle of her chin when she looked out across the open grass. The phone rang. It was Alcott. Her voice was careful, the professional flatness of someone trying not to transmit either hope or alarm before the facts were fully in order. She said that the plate had come back registered. She said she needed to make some additional inquiries before she could say more. She asked Rebecca how certain she was about what she had seen. Rebecca said, "I have looked at my daughter's face for 10 years. I know what I saw." Alcott said she would call back by morning. Rebecca did not sleep. What she did instead was something she had done before, but not like this, not with this much at stake, not with her hands trembling over a box of photographs she kept in the closet of her home office. She pulled the box out. She went through it. Every photograph she had from the period before June 14, 2001, the years when Sophie was small and David Mitchell was still, as far as anyone knew, a man who deserved to be trusted. There were school photographs. There were birthday party photographs. There was a class photo from Sophie's kindergarten year, the whole class arranged on risers in the gymnasium, children's faces squinting against the photographer's light, and at the edge of the frame, partly cut off but visible, a portion of David Mitchell's car in the parking lot behind the school in the spring of 2001. Rebecca pulled the photograph closer. She had looked at this image before. She had looked at every image in this box before, multiple times over multiple years, but she had never had a license plate number in her phone to compare against. She looked at the car in the photograph. She looked at the partial plate. She went still. She picked up her phone. She pulled up the number she had typed in at the park. She held the photograph under the lamp on her desk and looked at what was visible of the plate in the background of a 10-year-old kindergarten class photo. 3 characters. That was all she could make out clearly in the image. 3 characters of what was visible of the plate on David Mitchell's car in the parking lot of an elementary school in Cedar Park, Texas, in the spring of 2001. They matched. Rebecca Taylor sat at her desk at 2 in the morning and understood that the man she had seen in the park that afternoon had been driving the same car, or a car with the same plate, that David Mitchell had been driving a decade ago. She called Alcott again. She did not care that it was 2 in the morning. She explained what she had found. She described the photograph. She said she could bring it in first thing. Alcott, to her credit, did not tell her she was imagining things. Alcott said, "Bring it in at 7." Rebecca was there at 6:50. What happened next moved quickly, which was its own kind of disorientation after 10 years of almost nothing moving at all. Alcott had already run the plate through additional databases overnight, the registration connected to a name, Derek Howard Mitchell. An address in Bastrop County, approximately 40 miles east of Austin. A rural property, a parcel of land described in the records as a working farm. Derek Howard Mitchell. Investigators ran the name. Derek Howard Mitchell had a social security number, a driver's license, a thin but functional paper identity that had been constructed, as far as anyone could initially determine, sometime in the early 2000s. He had no prior criminal record under that name. He had no employment record in any major system. He had maintained a quiet, largely cash-based existence on a rural property that sat at the end of a county road, far enough from the nearest town to be invisible to casual observation. He had been there, as best the record suggested, for close to 9 years. He had been 40 miles from Austin. He had been 40 miles from Rebecca Taylor for 9 years. That detail would stay with investigators for a long time, and it would stay with Rebecca even longer. The particular cruelty of that geography, the possibility that on any of the dozens of occasions when Rebecca had driven south or east of Austin over the past 9 years, she had been within a short drive of her daughter without knowing it. Proximity and invisibility in the same breath. The investigation moved from verification to action over the course of the next 48 hours. Alcott worked with the Travis County Sheriff's Office and the Bastrop County Sheriff's Office to build a coordination protocol. They needed to be certain before they moved. They needed to confirm that the man living on that rural property was in fact David Mitchell, and they needed to do it in a way that did not alert him and give him any opportunity to run again. A decade of planning had gotten him this far. They were not going to give him the chance to use another decade of planning to disappear a second time. Surveillance of the Bastrop County property was established carefully. Officers working plain vehicles, civilian clothing, the kind of slow and patient observation that law enforcement in cases like this has to do before it can act. What they saw, over several days, confirmed what the license plate and the registration had already suggested. A man who matched the physical profile of David Mitchell, older now, heavier, different in the surface ways that 10 years change a person, but consistent in the structural ways that 10 years cannot change. The way he moved, the way he stood, the shape of a person. And a girl. A teenager, dark hair, moving around the property with the ordinary unconscious ease of someone who had grown up there. She fed animals. She carried things between outbuildings. She sat on the porch in the evenings. She was, by all observable evidence, a young woman living the routine life of a farm in central Texas, without any apparent sign of distress, without any visible indication that she understood her situation to be anything other than what she had been told it was. That, too, would require very careful handling. Rebecca Taylor was kept informed of developments, but was not included in operational decisions, which was the right call and also one of the harder things she had to sit with during those days. She understood why, she agreed with the reasoning, and she still found it nearly impossible to know that her daughter was 40 miles away and that she had to wait. She waited. The arrest of David Mitchell, operating under the assumed identity of Derek Howard Mitchell, took place on a Tuesday morning in late July of 2011. Officers from multiple agencies approached the property at a time and in a manner designed to give him the least possible opportunity to react. He was located near one of the outbuildings when they arrived. He was taken into custody without resistance. He said nothing. That was what the officers present noted afterward. He did not argue. He did not claim to be someone else. He did not produce paperwork or appeal to any identity. He looked at the officers and he went quiet, in a way that, as one investigator later described it, was the quiet of a man who knew this moment was coming and had decided somewhere along the line that when it came, he would not insult anyone's intelligence by pretending. He said nothing. Inside the farmhouse, officers found what 10 years of constructed fiction looked like in physical form. Documents establishing the identity of Derek Howard Mitchell, a homeschooling curriculum, organized and extensive, spanning years of materials across multiple subjects. Photographs on the walls, a life documented in images that showed a girl growing up on a farm, birthdays marked, seasons marked, a childhood assembled with the particular care of someone who understood that a child needed a history to feel anchored. The girl's room had books. It had drawings on the wall, not so different, Rebecca would later note, with a complexity of feeling she could not fully articulate, from the drawings that still hung in the room in Cedar Park. Her name in every document in that house was Emily Rose Mitchell. She had been Emily Rose Mitchell for essentially her entire conscious life. When officers spoke with her on the property that morning, she was cooperative in the way that a person is cooperative when they do not yet understand what is happening. She was 16 years old. She knew the man who had just been taken into custody as her father. She knew herself as Emily. She knew the farm, the county road, the small town 20 minutes away where she occasionally went with him to buy supplies, as home. She did not know about Cedar Park. She did not know about Rebecca Taylor. She did not know about June 14, 2001. The process of telling her, of sitting with her and beginning the long, careful work of reorienting her to a reality she had no framework for was handled by trained professionals from Child Protective Services in coordination with law enforcement. It was not a single conversation. It was not a single day. The full weight of what she was being told, that her entire identity had been constructed by a man who had taken her from her mother before she was old enough to remember anything different, was not something that could be absorbed in an hour or a week. She was placed in protective care. Rebecca Taylor was told that her daughter had been located and was safe. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning. Alcott made it herself. She did not use cautious language. She said, "Rebecca, we found Sophie. She is alive and she is safe." Rebecca Taylor, who had not cried in any sustained way in years, who had converted all of that into forward motion and function and the daily discipline of continuing to look, sat down on her kitchen floor and cried for a long time. She sat next to the refrigerator, her back against the cabinet, and she cried the way you cry when something breaks open that has been held closed for too long. The initial reunion between Rebecca and Sophie, between the woman who had never stopped being her mother and the young woman who did not yet know how to place that word in the context of her actual life, happened under careful and supervised conditions. Counselors were present. The setting was neutral. Every detail had been thought about by professionals whose job was to protect the psychological well-being of a teenager in an extraordinarily disorienting situation. Rebecca had been counseled extensively on what to expect. She had spoken with professionals who worked with recovered missing children. She had read everything she could find. She had tried in the weeks between Mitchell's arrest and the first meeting to calibrate her expectations, to reach for something sustainable rather than the overwhelming flood of emotion she felt every time she thought about walking into a room and seeing her daughter's face. She had been told not to expect recognition. She had been told not to expect immediate warmth. She had been told that Sophie, who knew herself as Emily and had spent 16 years building a self on that foundation, might need a very long time before she could understand the relationship they were supposed to have. None of that preparation fully managed what it felt like to walk into that room. Sophie was sitting in a chair near the window. She looked up when Rebecca came in. She had her mother's eyes exactly, the eyes that Rebecca had seen every morning in her mirror for 16 years and never stopped seeing also in Sophie's kindergarten photographs. She was taller than Rebecca had imagined her. She sat in the particular way that teenagers sit, folded into themselves a little, guarded in a way that was entirely understandable and also heartbreaking. She said, "They told me your name is Rebecca." Rebecca said, "Yes." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that holds more weight than most conversations. Sophie looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the window. She said, "He told me my mother died when I was a baby." That was what David Mitchell had constructed, the foundational lie at the center of everything. He had told a child young enough to have no competing memories that she had been born into loss, that her mother was gone, that the only family she had was the one he was providing. He had built a world around her, and he had built it on that lie first, before anything else, because a child who believed her mother was dead would not spend her life looking for a way back. It was a calculated cruelty dressed up as a kind of love. Rebecca sat down across from her daughter and said, "I have been looking for you since the day you disappeared. I have never stopped looking, not one day." Sophie looked at her. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "He told me you died." Rebecca said, "I know." The legal process that followed Mitchell's arrest moved through the courts over the course of the next year. He was charged under Texas law with multiple counts, including aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and offenses related to the fraudulent documentation he had used to construct and maintain the identity of Derek Howard. The case also drew federal attention, given the interstate dimensions of the disappearance and the length of the concealment. Mitchell's defense made limited arguments. His attorney put forward the position that Mitchell had believed, sincerely if irrationally, that he was protecting Sophie from a home environment he had perceived as unstable. It was a characterization that investigators and Rebecca Taylor's legal representation addressed thoroughly in court. The record showed no report of any concern about Sophie's home environment ever filed by Mitchell or anyone else. No documentation of any expressed worry, no call to Child Protective Services, no contact with any authority. What the record showed instead was a man who had planned a disappearance months in advance, who had resigned from his position, liquidated cash, assumed a false identity, and maintained that identity for a decade while a child grew up believing her mother was dead. The jury deliberated for less than a day. David Mitchell was convicted on all primary counts and sentenced to 25 years in state prison. He was led out of the courtroom without speaking. Rebecca Taylor sat in the gallery and watched him go. She had attended every day of the trial. She had not testified because the prosecution had determined that her testimony was not necessary to establish the core facts, and because her attorneys and the victim advocates involved in the case had advised that the emotional cost was not worth the marginal evidentiary benefit. She agreed. She sat in the gallery and she watched the proceeding with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting to see justice applied for over a decade. When the sentence was read, she closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. There was still work to do. The work of rebuilding a relationship with a daughter who did not yet fully know her was not something that fit into a news cycle or a court calendar. It moved at its own pace, which was slow and sometimes painful, and occasionally, in the way that careful and honest things sometimes are, quietly miraculous. Sophie. She worked toward the name. She had been Emily for so long that Sophie felt, in her mouth, like a word in a foreign language, recognizable by its shape but not yet belonging to her in the way that a name is supposed to belong to a person. Her counselors encouraged her to take as much time as she needed with the question of what to call herself, and she took that time seriously. She was a serious young woman. That was something Rebecca had not fully been able to predict from the projections and the photographs, the quality of her actual personality. She was precise. She was thoughtful. She asked questions carefully and waited for complete answers. She did not rush anything. Slowly, the architecture of a shared history began to be built between them. Not recovered, exactly, because what had been lost could not be fully recovered, but built. Rebecca brought photographs, the ones from Cedar Park, the ones from Sophie's first years. She brought the drawings from the wall of Sophie's room, carefully removed and preserved. She brought the picture books with the cracked spines. She brought evidence of a childhood that had existed before the one Sophie remembered. Sophie looked at the photographs for a long time. She looked at herself as a baby, as a toddler, as a 5-year-old, as a 6-year-old in a yellow sundress with white daisies along the hem. She said, "I don't remember any of this." Rebecca said, "I know, but it happened. You were there, and you were loved." That is the thing about memory and identity that this case sits inside so uncomfortably. What Sophie remembered was real. The farm was real. The life she had lived on that property was real in the sense that she had lived it, that it had formed her, that it was the ground she had grown from. The man she had called her father had also, in the most terrible and contradictory sense, raised her. She had been cared for in the material ways that a child needs to be cared for. She had been educated. She had been kept physically safe. None of that made what he did acceptable. None of that resolved the fundamental violence of the lie at the center of her life. But the complexity of it was something that Sophie carried, that she had to find a way to hold alongside everything else she was learning about herself and her history. Her counselors worked with her for years. That is not a detail that fits cleanly into a narrative of resolution, but it is the most honest and important thing to say. The recovery from something like this does not end when the court case ends. It does not end when the first reunion happens. It is long work, private work, work that happens in rooms away from cameras and public narratives. Rebecca Taylor gave her daughter that room. She did not go to the media with photographs from their meetings. She did not give interviews about the details of their relationship. She protected the privacy of a teenager who had already had her life's most intimate facts become a matter of public record. and she did so because she understood that Sophie's healing had to come before any version of the story that anyone else needed to hear. What emerged over time and over years was a relationship. Not the relationship they would have had. That one existed only in the imagination, in the alternate history where a 6-year-old came home for lunch on June 14, 2001, and grew up in Cedar Park and never had to unlearn her own name. That relationship was gone. But the one that grew in its place, slowly and carefully and honestly, was real in its own right. Sophie took back her name.
Not immediately, and not completely, and with a kind of provisional quality that her counselors described as healthy and appropriate. She did not erase Emily. She could not, and trying to would have meant trying to erase the only self she had known. But she began to add Sophie back, to hold both, to understand that she was a person who contained a history she had not been allowed to know, and that knowing it now was not an ending, but a beginning. Rebecca Taylor marked the 10-year anniversary of the recovery, the summer of 2021, in a quiet way. She and Sophie were in each other's lives by then in a way that had been built slowly and genuinely through years of honest work on both sides. It was not the reunion of movies, the tearful instant bond, the seamless picking up of lost threads. It was something harder and realer than that. It was two people who had been separated by one man's deliberate cruelty, finding each other across the wreckage he had left behind and choosing to build something that belonged to them. There are things about this case that still do not have clean answers. Why David Mitchell did what he did is one of them. The question of motive is one that the trial touched on but never fully resolved, because Mitchell never spoke, not during the investigation, not during the trial, not after sentencing. He made no statement, he offered no explanation. His attorney's characterization of a man who had believed he was protecting a child was not supported by any evidence and was rejected by the jury, but it also did not come from Mitchell himself. It came from the legal necessity of constructing a defense. What drove a man with no prior record, no documented grievance, no apparent relationship with Sophie beyond the professional one to plan, execute, and maintain a decade-long abduction is a question that the facts of the case answer only partially. He planned it. He wanted her. Beyond that, the interior of his reasoning remains, like the man himself, locked in silence. That silence is its own kind of answer. There are also questions about the systems that failed along the way, the tip that came in from New Mexico in 2003, the records from the central Texas counties that Detective Alcott found in 2007, the 9 years during which David Mitchell, operating as Derek Howard Mitchell, maintained a fraudulent identity in a state with extensive law enforcement resources and within driving distance of the city where Sophie had disappeared. These are not small failures. They are the kind of failures that deserve the kind of scrutiny that makes future cases harder to slip through. Rebecca Taylor has spoken about this publicly, and she has done so without bitterness, which is remarkable, and with the specific focus of someone who understands that bitterness is not the same as accountability. She has been part of conversations about how missing children's cases are maintained over long periods. She has spoken about the resource gap between the urgent first weeks of a case and the years that follow. She has used her experience not as a wound to display, but as a tool to push for better. And then there is Sophie. Sophie Grace Taylor, who also knows herself as Emily, who is in her late 20s now, living a life that is entirely her own, that she has built on terms she chose, in a direction no one mapped for her.
She has spoken publicly once in a single written statement released several years after the case resolved, and in it she said something that has stayed with the people who followed this case and that deserves to be held carefully and with respect. She said that she had spent a long time trying to figure out how to be both people at once, the person she had been told she was and the person she actually was. She said that she had eventually come to understand that the two were not opposites, that a person could be shaped by a lie and still be real, that the work of finding out who you actually are underneath what someone else decided you would be was the most important work she had ever done. She said she was doing it. She said she was still doing it. She said that was enough. Rebecca Taylor, when asked what she wants people to take from this case, has consistently said the same thing. She says, "Do not let the cold cases go cold in your community. Do not let the posters fade without noticing. Do not assume that because a case is old, it is resolved." She says, "I found my daughter because I kept looking, and because a woman I had never met had a feeling at a birthday party in a park and trusted it enough to take out her phone." She says, "Pay attention. Trust what you notice. It might be 10 years too late and still exactly on time." This story is a reminder that the people we think are gone are sometimes just hidden. That the distance between a missing child and their parent can be, in the most terrible irony, as short as 40 miles and as long as a decade. That the thread does not always break just because it goes taut for a very long time. And it is a reminder that the work of finding someone does not end when you find them. That the real work, the harder and longer and more important work, is what comes after. Sophie and Rebecca are proof of that. They are still doing that work. That is, in the end, the most honest resolution this story has. Not a clean ending, but a living one. If this episode meant something to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Sophie's deserve to be heard, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. Share this episode with someone who cares about these cases. Leave a comment below. Let us know what you were thinking. We read every one. We will see you in the next one.